two major developments dropped within hours of each other, and together they represent the most significant legal and legislative defeats Donald Trump has faced in months. First, the United States Senate voted 58-42 to block a White House-backed initiative that would have transferred operational control of the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts to a presidentially appointed board stacked with Trump loyalists. Then, less than 3 hours later, a federal judge in the Southern District of New York imposed a $75 million fine on the Trump Organization for what the court described as systematic fraud, tax evasion, and willful misrepresentation of asset values. These aren't symbolic setbacks. These are concrete institutional rejections of Trump's authority, backed by constitutional power and legal enforcement mechanisms. The Senate vote wasn't close, the court ruling wasn't ambiguous, and the message being sent to the White House is unmistakable. The limits of presidential power still exist, and institutions will defend them.
Let's start with the Kennedy Center takeover attempt, because the audacity of this move reveals everything about how Trump views cultural institutions and federal property. The John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts is a living memorial to President Kennedy, established by Congress in 1958 and opened in 1971. It operates as a nonprofit institution that receives federal funding but maintains independence from direct political control. Its mission is to serve as the nation's cultural center, hosting performances, supporting arts education, and preserving American artistic heritage without partisan interference. In December 2025, the White House quietly introduced legislation that would restructure the Kennedy Center's governance. The proposal called for dissolving the current Board of Trustees and replacing it with a new oversight body, whose members would be directly appointed by the president.
The proposal moved through the House on a party-line vote in early January 2026. Republicans argued it would increase efficiency and transparency. Democrats warned it would politicize an institution that had remained independent for 50 years. The real battle was always going to be in the Senate, where several moderate Republicans had expressed discomfort with the idea of presidential control over cultural programming. Now shift to the Trump Organization fine, because this represents years of investigation culminating in judicial accountability. The case originated with the New York Attorney General's office, which launched a civil fraud investigation into the Trump Organization in 2019. The investigation examined whether the company systematically inflated asset values when seeking loans and insurance, then deflated those same assets when calculating tax obligations. Over 3 years, investigators compiled thousands of documents showing a The case went to trial in September 2025. For 6 weeks, prosecutors presented evidence of deliberate fraud. Financial experts testified that the discrepancies were too systematic and too consistent to be accidental errors. Former Trump Organization employees described internal practices designed to manipulate valuations. The defense argued these were standard business practices and that sophisticated lenders conducted their own due diligence. On January 14, 2026, Federal Judge Katherine Morrison issued her ruling. The written decision was 147 pages long and methodically demolished every defense argument. The Trump Organization was found liable for fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, falsifying business records, and insurance fraud. The court imposed a $75 million fine and imposed restrictions on the company's ability to conduct business in New York with enhanced oversight.
The Senate vote on the Kennedy Center takeover unfolded on the afternoon of January 14th. The chamber was full, which itself was notable. Senators typically skip floor votes on legislation they view as non-controversial, but this vote had become a proxy battle over presidential overreach and institutional independence.
Both sides knew the outcome would send a message far beyond the Kennedy Center. Senate Majority Leader opened debate by framing the issue as one of accountability. The American people deserve transparency in how their tax dollars are spent, he argued. Appointing a presidential oversight board ensures the Kennedy Center remains responsive to the public interest, rather than serving as a playground for coastal elites. The argument was carefully constructed to appeal to populist sentiment while obscuring the actual power grab. Federal funding for the Kennedy Center amounts to roughly $40 million annually, a fraction of its overall budget. The institution already undergoes regular audits and reports to Congress. The accountability argument was rhetorical cover for political control. Senator Patrick Leahy, the senior Democrat from Vermont, delivered the opposition's opening statement. His voice carried the weight of someone who had served in the Senate for nearly 50 years and witnessed multiple administrations attempt various forms of institutional overreach. "This is not about accountability," Leahy said, his tone calm but forceful. "This is about a president who cannot tolerate institutions he doesn't control." The Kennedy Center has operated independently for half a century. It has survived Democratic and Republican administrations without becoming a political weapon. That independence is precisely what this legislation seeks to destroy. The debate continued for 3 hours. Republicans argued the legislation simply modernized governance structures. Democrats countered that modernization was code for politicization. But the real drama came when Senator Lisa Murkowski, a Republican from Alaska, rose to speak.
Murkowski had been publicly undecided on the vote. As a moderate Republican who occasionally broke with her party, her vote was considered crucial. When she spoke, the chamber fell quiet. "I have spent considerable time reviewing this legislation and consulting with Kennedy Center leadership, arts organizations, and constitutional scholars," Murkowski began. "What I have concluded is that this proposal solves a problem that does not exist while creating a dangerous precedent that threatens institutional independence across the federal government. I will be voting no." That statement shifted the calculus instantly. If Murkowski was voting no, other moderate Republicans would have political cover to do the same. Within minutes, Senator Mitt Romney announced he would also oppose the legislation, then Susan Collins, then several others who had been quietly skeptical but unwilling to be the first to break ranks. When the vote was called, the result was decisive, 58-42 against the takeover. 8 Republicans joined all 50 Democrats in blocking the legislation. The margin of defeat was significant because it meant the vote wasn't even close enough to justify another attempt. The Senate had spoken clearly. Presidential control over the Kennedy Center would not be permitted. Less than 3 hours after the Senate vote, federal Judge Katherine Morrison's ruling in the Trump Organization case became public. The timing was coincidental, but the symbolic impact was powerful. In the span of a single afternoon, Trump faced rejection from both the legislative and judicial branches. Judge Morrison's written opinion was methodical and devastating. She began by outlining the legal standard for fraud, knowingly making false statements with the intent to deceive and causing financial harm. She then systematically demonstrated that the Trump Organization met every element of that standard. The opinion detailed specific properties and specific misrepresentations. Trump Tower in Manhattan was valued at $327 million when seeking a loan in 2014, but appraised at $118 million for tax purposes that same year. The Seven Springs estate in Westchester County was listed at $291 million in financial statements provided to Deutsche Bank, but valued at $56 million for property tax assessments. The Trump National Golf Club in Los Angeles claimed to be worth $158 million in loan documents, while simultaneously arguing to tax authorities it should be assessed at $10 million.
These weren't minor discrepancies or good faith differences of professional opinion. These were systematic, deliberate misrepresentations designed to maximize financial benefit while minimizing tax obligations and insurance costs. Judge Morrison noted that the valuations flip-flopped consistently, depending on the audience. High for lenders and insurers, low for tax authorities. The opinion also addressed intent, which is critical in fraud cases. The Trump Organization argued that any errors were unintentional and that sophisticated financial institutions conducted their own due diligence. Judge Morrison rejected that defense completely. She cited internal emails showing company executives discussing how to justify higher valuations. She referenced testimony from former employees describing a corporate culture where inflating asset values was standard practice. She pointed to the sheer consistency of the pattern across dozens of properties over many years. This was not negligence, Judge Morrison wrote. This was not a series of innocent mistakes. This was a deliberate, systematic scheme to defraud lenders, insurers, and tax authorities. The evidence demonstrates that senior Trump Organization officials,
The financial penalties were substantial. The court imposed a base fine of $50 million for the fraud itself. An additional $15 million was added for willful and egregious conduct. Another $10 million was imposed as a deterrent penalty designed to prevent similar behavior in the future. The total, $75 million, one of the largest fraud penalties ever imposed on a family-owned business. But the financial penalty wasn't the only consequence. Judge Morrison also imposed operational restrictions. For the next 5 years, the Trump Organization must maintain an independent compliance monitor with full access to financial records. Any transaction exceeding $5 million requires prior approval from this monitor. The company must submit quarterly reports to the court detailing all significant financial activities. And the company is barred from obtaining loans from any New York-based financial institution during this period without court approval. These restrictions essentially place the Trump Organization under supervised probation. The company can still operate, but with constant oversight and significant constraints on its activities. For an organization that has operated with minimal accountability for decades, this represents a fundamental restructuring of how business is conducted. The Senate vote blocking the Kennedy Center takeover carries implications far beyond one cultural institution. It establishes a precedent that Congress will resist presidential attempts to politicize federally funded organizations that have traditionally operated with independence. That precedent matters because Trump has already signaled interest in restructuring other institutions. The White House had been quietly exploring similar takeover mechanisms for the Smithsonian Institution, which operates 19 museums and galleries. Trump has repeatedly criticized certain Smithsonian exhibits as promoting woke ideology and has suggested that museum content should be subject to presidential approval. The Kennedy Center vote sends a clear message. The Senate will not permit that kind of political interference. The vote also demonstrated that moderate Republicans are willing to break with Trump on institutional independence issues. 8 Republicans voted against their president's preferred legislation. That coalition of moderates plus Democrats represents a potential blocking force for future overreach attempts. Trump cannot simply ram through legislation reshaping federal institutions if he lacks unanimous Republican support in the Senate. Politically, the Kennedy Center defeat is embarrassing for the White House. The legislation was a priority that Trump personally promoted. He held meetings with Republican senators, urging them to support it. He threatened primary challenges against Republicans who opposed it, and he lost anyway. That visible defeat undermines his image of dominance and control within his own party. The Trump Organization fine carries even more severe consequences. $75 million is a substantial financial burden, but the operational restrictions may be more damaging than the monetary penalty. The independent compliance monitor will have access to everything: financial records, contracts, communications, internal strategy documents.
That level of transparency is unprecedented for the Trump Organization, which has always operated with minimal outside scrutiny. The restrictions also limit the company's ability to expand or make major deals. Any transaction over $5 million requires monitor approval. That means potential business partners know that any deal with the Trump Organization comes with an extra layer of oversight and potential delay. That makes the company a less attractive partner and reduces its competitive position in the real estate market. The ban on obtaining loans from New York financial institutions is particularly damaging. New York is the center of American real estate finance. The Trump Organization's business model has always relied on leveraging borrowed money to fund acquisitions and development. Being cut off from New York lenders for 5 years fundamentally constrains the company's ability to grow. There's also the reputational damage. A federal judge has found that the Trump Organization engaged in systematic fraud. That finding will appear in background checks, due diligence reports, and media coverage for years. Business partners, potential tenants, and licensing deals all become more difficult when your company has been judicially determined to be fraudulent. The ruling also has implications for Trump's other legal battles. Federal prosecutors in multiple jurisdictions are pursuing criminal cases involving financial fraud. This civil court finding that the Trump Organization systematically misrepresented asset values provides powerful evidence that can be cited in those criminal cases. Defense attorneys typically argue that valuation disputes are subjective business disagreements, but when a federal judge has already found deliberate fraud, that defense becomes much weaker. Politically, the fine reinforces the narrative that Trump's business empire was built on deception. His political brand has always been successful businessman who can run the country like a business. But if the business was built on fraud, that entire narrative collapses. Voters who supported Trump because they viewed him as a competent executive face uncomfortable questions about whether that competence was actually just willingness to break the rules. The Trump Organization has 30 days to pay the $75 million fine or file an appeal. If they appeal, they must post a bond for the full amount plus anticipated interest. That bond requirement exists to prevent defendants from delaying payment indefinitely through appeals. Given the Trump Organization's demonstrated history of inflating asset values to obtain financing, finding a bonding company willing to accept their assets as collateral may prove difficult. If the fine isn't paid and no appeal bond is posted, the court can begin seizing Trump Organization assets. Real properties can be placed under receivership. Bank accounts can be frozen. Business operations can be disrupted. The compliance monitor gains even broader authority to oversee asset liquidation to satisfy the judgment. Meanwhile, the company must immediately begin implementing the court-ordered compliance measures. The independent monitor must be hired within 45 days. That monitor gets full access to financial records, including documents the Trump Organization has fought for years to keep confidential. Every significant transaction must be disclosed. Every financial statement must be verified. The era of operating in the shadows is over. For Trump personally, these twin defeats landing on the same day create a narrative of institutional resistance. The Senate blocked his attempt to control a cultural institution. A federal court imposed massive penalties on his family business. Neither the legislative branch nor the judicial branch is willing to defer to presidential or corporate power. The checks and balances built into American government are functioning exactly as designed. The political impact extends to Trump's broader agenda. When a president suffers high-profile defeats, it emboldens opposition and demoralizes allies. Senate Republicans who voted against the Kennedy Center takeover demonstrated they're willing to defy Trump when they believe he's overreaching. That makes future legislative battles more difficult. Every controversial proposal now faces skeptical scrutiny from moderates who have proven they'll vote no when necessary. The Kennedy Center vote also revealed the limits of Trump's political threats. He had warned Republicans that opposing the legislation would result in primary challenges and loss of party support. 8 senators voted no anyway, calculating that defending institutional independence was worth the political risk. That calculation by sitting senators suggests Trump's grip on the Republican Party may be weaker than it appears.
For cultural institutions across America, the Senate vote provides crucial protection. Museum directors, arts administrators, and nonprofit leaders who feared politicization now have evidence that Congress will resist presidential interference. That doesn't mean the threat has disappeared, but it does mean there are institutional defenders willing to fight. For the Trump Organization, the next 30 days will determine whether this case becomes a financial crisis or merely a significant setback. Raising $75 million quickly isn't easy, even for a large real estate company. Posting an appeal bond of that size is even more difficult. The company may be forced to sell assets, which in a distress sale typically means accepting below-market prices. The compliance monitor's arrival will fundamentally change how the Trump Organization operates. For decades, the company functioned with minimal oversight and maximum opacity. That era has ended. Every financial decision will now be scrutinized. Every transaction will require justification. The freewheeling deal-making style that defined Trump's business career cannot continue under these restrictions.
Both developments represent the reassertion of institutional authority against executive overreach and corporate fraud. The Senate demonstrated that Congress retains the power to block presidential interference with independent institutions. The federal court demonstrated that systematic fraud carries severe financial and operational consequences, regardless of who owns the company. These aren't theoretical victories for abstract principles. These are concrete instances of institutions defending their authority and imposing real costs on those who violate legal and constitutional boundaries. The Kennedy Center remains independent. The Trump Organization faces $75 million in fines and 5 years of monitored probation. Neither outcome was inevitable. Both required institutions willing to enforce their authority. The question now is whether these defeats prompt recalibration or escalation. Does Trump recognize that institutional limits still exist and adjust his behavior accordingly? Or does he view these setbacks as proof that he needs to attack institutions even more aggressively? The answer will determine whether January 14, 2026, represents a turning point toward constitutional normalcy or merely a temporary speed bump on the road to further confrontation.